few, if any, of these toll projects are even attracting enough traffic to pay for themselves. They're not even covering the debt service on these toll roads. SH-130 around Austin, case in point. They were sold, oh, this is going to solve all the traffic problems on I-35. Well, here we are, all these years later. It's been probably 4 years, 3 or 4 years that road has been open. Still gridlock on I-35, did nothing to solve congestion, and we have it on the record in March of 2009, the Transportation Commission admitting that our gas tax dollars are going to fund and subsidize what tolls don't cover on SH-130. So all Texans are paying for that road, but you can only use the road if you can afford $12 a day to take that road. Hence, that's why no one's taking the road. So anyway, it's not solving our problem. It's not solving the revenue problem, and it's certainly not relieving congestion. The taxpayers are being set up for what I believe will be a huge infrastructure bailout, not unlike the banking crisis that we had, because more than half the states have already passed laws that allow them to do this kind of risky financing schemes. And it'll be deemed too big to fail, and you and I are going to be the ones on the hook for the billions in debt that they've already sunk us into. They're opening roads in Austin that are 100% paid for with gas taxes. They're opening them as toll roads to help cover the debt service that they can't cover with the toll users on their current Central Texas Turnpike system. So there's a huge problem, folks, and they're stealing from Peter to pay Paul, and they're exacerbating it with double taxation and these Robin Hood schemes. So how do we accomplish our agenda? How do we stop them from sinking us further and further into debt? Well, first we have the legislative. We're going to go over 3 things. It'll be legislative, political, and legal, if you remember the 3 that we just showed a few minutes ago. First, we're going to talk about the basics. I'm going to get more and more advanced as we go through it. So if you really don't want to get into all the nuts and bolts of the advanced stuff, you're welcome to leave. But that's where we're headed. We're going to kind of gradually take it into more detail. So we're going to go over the basics of how a bill becomes law, how legislation gets drafted, how to watchdog and shepherd legislation through the process, and how to effectively lobby. At least I hope I can give some advice on that, even though in a lot of ways we feel like we're not very effective sometimes. Okay, so here's the citizen lobbying overview of how we're going to go in a graduated way up into a more advanced training. We're going to do the basics first, then we're going to do intermediate about how bills are introduced, how interim studies work, committee assignments, and all of that. The role of the speaker and the lieutenant governor, and calendars, the all-important calendars. We'll talk about that. And then in the advanced, this is really where it's at, isn't it? If you want to be someone that can come up to Austin and be a legislative watchdog and actually lobby and advocate for the taxpayers up in Austin and meet face-to-face with lawmakers on a regular basis, this is truly what you have to know to be able to get through the smoke and mirrors of the talking points they'll throw back at you. Because they'll tell you things like it's a user fee, it's the free market solution for roads, it's the most conservative way because it's privatization, and private companies do things better than government. And all of these talking points they give us that are false. They are based on false assumptions that don't work. They don't square with reality. So this is where we're going to get into that, of all these buzzwords they use like local control and smaller government and all these types of things. We're going to basically blow a hole through every single one of those. And then we're going to talk about some of how to read the bill, how to read a bill with true understanding, to understand what design build CDAs mean, to understand what a concession CDA is, and the infrastructure bank loans and many other things. And then, of course, the main thing is, who's benefiting from the passage of this legislation? That's what we always have to ask ourselves. It's not generally the taxpayers, I can tell you that. So let's first talk about, this is real simple, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but how to draft legislation. There's really 3 main ways you can do it. The lobbyists obviously hire their attorneys. That's very expensive. We don't have money for full-time lawyers that sit around and write legislation for us all day long. So here's what the taxpayers can do. There's 3 ways we can do it. We can hire our own lawyers, like the lobbyists do, which is very expensive. Or we can find a think tank that might agree with an issue, like taxpayer-funded lobbying, for instance, outlawing that, since TxDOT has done that repeatedly. And then they can have their lawyers draft a piece of legislation for you, and you can shop it to a legislator that's friendly. Or you can enlist an actual lawmaker, good guy, to draft it using what they call leg counsel. They actually have a whole team of lawyers during the legislative session whose job it is to draft legislation for the legislators. They say, I want to change this in the code, or I want to, make this, cut this tax in half, or I want to, eliminate property tax, or whatever. And they come up with it at leg counsel. Okay, so that's generally how we have done it. I just want you to know, on our legislative agenda, last session, we had about the same number of items. We had a lawmaker that put forward either through amendment or by bill for every single one of these items. Now, they didn't all pass, but I bet you 90% of the lobbyists up there don't have that. They have not had everything on their agenda authored by somebody in the legislature. So it's a lot of work, but it can be done. Okay, so the next thing, we're going to jump to a graphic. This is the actual overview. This is actually on the Texas Legislature online website. That's going to be the key website again, and I'll show you the web address here in a minute. But here is a diagram that kind of takes you through how a bill becomes law. Obviously, we have two chambers of the legislature, the House and the Senate. The governor doesn't come into play, technically speaking, till the end, whether he signs a bill or vetoes a bill. But we all know that he's got an ex-Democrat, by the way, for those who are conservatives and really think he's a conservative. Remember, Perry used to be a Democrat, then turned to conservative when the wave took him that direction. And so he's got himself an ex-Democrat lawmaker. Armbrister is his last name. And he's down on the floor, and I call him Arm Twister, because he's twisting all their arms to do what the governor wants all session long. So don't think that the governor's not involved in all this. He's just behind the scenes. Okay, so let's start with the House. It's very similar on both sides. First, a bill is introduced. They give it a number, and then it's read the first time and referred to a committee by the Speaker. That's what happens in the House. In the Senate, very similar, except it's referred to committee by the Lieutenant Governor. The Lieutenant Governor in Texas basically is the President of the Senate, and he gets to decide, and nothing comes to the floor unless it goes through the Lieutenant Governor's hands. Okay? Extremely powerful. Speaker, in a sense, is very similar because he appoints all the committee chairs, and nothing gets to the floor for a vote unless it passes a committee, and unless it's heard in committee first. Okay, so then the next thing is the committee studies the bill, posts public notice of hearing, holds a public hearing, or acts in some formal meeting, resulting in either a favorable report or an unfavorable report. And, you know, there's really nothing, this is sort of antiquated or archaic if you want to call it that. There really is no unfavorable report. What happens is it just dies in committee. They don't really, I've never seen anything come out of a committee as an unfavorable report. They just don't, you know, they don't have the votes to pass it. So let's say they get a favorable report, so the bill keeps moving. So now you have either a committee substitute, or you amend the bill, or you have no amendment and you just keep the bill as filed. Then the bill is printed on a committee report and distributed. That's called the first printing. Okay, then on this side it's very similar. The Senate committees also post notice of public hearing, and they study the bill. They either have unfavorable report, which doesn't happen, or a favorable report, and they either do a substitute or an amendment or no amending of the bill. These can also be, as you can see here, revived by a minority report on a motion adopted by a majority vote of the Senate. So they can bring it up through some floor proceedings. They can try and revive bills that don't ever make it out of committee. That's very rarely used. I don't think I've even seen it done, at least not in the last session. But I'm not there every day, so I don't totally know all that. Okay, so then the bill gets printed or distributed on the Senate side. But down here, after the distributing and printing, it talks about how it goes to calendars. That is the key, is to know about calendars. This is how, another way for a bill to either get through the process or fail. Really, the system's set up for a bill not to pass, just so you know. There's far more to navigate to get it through the hoops than it is. It's far easier to kill a bill than it is to pass something, which is why it's been so hard to get our agenda passed. Okay, so bill goes to calendars committee, right here at the top. This is on the House side still. And then they have to assign it to the calendar, and that means the full House will consider the bill only if it gets on the calendar, and that has to be scheduled. It's like a pipeline or a queue, you know, a queue that they put it in, okay? So then when they take it up on a floor vote, it's called the second reading. They can debate the bill, amend it by majority vote, and then they pass it on to what's called a third reading. Okay, so when they file the bill, it's first reading, even though I really feel like when they take it up in committee is more like a first hearing. Because a lot of bills are filed, very few get a hearing in committee. So that's already the first hurdle. If you have a bill heard in committee, that's the first step toward moving your bill forward. And then after that, you want to have a floor vote. And if you can pass and survive the floor vote, then there's something called third reading. You can have debate and amendment there, but by 2/3 vote, it has to happen on final passage by the House. Okay, so it's a much higher threshold at that point. Then amendments are what they call engrossed into the text of the bill, and then they send it over to the Senate. Very similar on the Senate side. The bill is brought up. Now, there are some rules that are quirky to the Senate as far as how you even get a floor vote, okay? There's 2 calendars in the Senate. They only have 1 calendar in the House, at least that I'm aware of. So there's 2 in the Senate. One's called the local and uncontested calendar, and the other one's called the general calendar. Now, if you get something on the local and uncontested calendar, it's basically guaranteed to sail through. They call it uncontested because it means it's a non-controversial bill, nobody's got any issues with it, and they just sail it through. They actually do not vote on it as a body on the floor. They have a guy that gets there. This is the Committee on Administration. That's what they call their, on the House they call it the Calendars Committee, and the Senate they call it the Committee on Administration. The chair of that committee at 7 a.m. each day takes the list of bills all by himself and passes them out. Basically, they give a calendar, written calendar of all the bills that are on this local and uncontested calendar for a certain number of days, and all the members will cast their vote and get it to the Committee on the Administration so that the chairman knows how many votes he's got for and against different bills. And that's how they pass these bills out. It's not actually taken by a floor vote. Now, if they want that vote recorded in a journal, let's say you say that you're against tax increases and one of these bills passes and it's a tax hike, even though you're not formally opposing the bill, they can mark I voted no in the journal, but they have to reduce it to the journal. It doesn't automatically go in the journal when it's on the local and uncontested calendar. The other calendar is called the general calendar, and this is where your bill has a much bigger hurdle in the Senate to get through. Now, when you have this, the only way to have your bill even brought up for consideration on the floor is if you have 2/3 vote in the Senate. Well, even with the Republican wave last November, there is not a Republican majority, not a 2/3 majority in the Senate. Yeah. They have to have at least 2 Democrats to work with the Republicans to get anything passed in the Senate, or at least have your bill debated, much less passed. But most people aren't going to, if you get a 2/3 threshold just to debate your bill, chances are they've already counted their votes. They know they're going to get the bill passed in general. Okay, so a 2/3 vote of the Senate is to suspend the rules to take up the bill by debate. Then they have a second reading. They can debate and amend that by majority vote, and they go on to third reading. Third reading is, again, by 2/3 vote for final passage. Now, if it's amended, it has to go back to the House. If not amended, you'll see it'll go to the governor, I believe. Okay, we'll get to that in just a second. So now, if in the House they have the second reading debated, third reading, final passage, amendments are engrossed into the text of the bill and goes to the other chamber. The same thing you'll see here after they have it final passage or amended, they go over to the House. Then the House engrossed text with the Senate amendments is printed and distributed. That's called the second printing. So they have first, second, third reading and first and second printing. Gets crazy. Okay, then the House, if they refuse to concur with the conference committee, let's say that there's 2 competing bills. They have similar bills and captions, and they deal with the same section of the law, but the House says, oh, we want the tax hike to be $50, and the Senate wants it to be $75. So there's a difference in the bill. So that has to go to conference committee. And then they have 5 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate, and that's, again, where the lieutenant governor and the speaker come into play, because that's who appoints the conferees. So the conferees then are supposed to meet, convene, and decide what stays in the bill, what goes, but they're very limited to only what's in the 2 versions of the bill. They can't just rehash legislation and write legislation on the fly in conference committee, although it does happen.
U.S. Congress
Right, it does happen, but they're not supposed to. And what happens in most conference committees, to be honest, they don't even meet. They just have this staffer talk to their staffer, and everybody just talks among the conferees and says, okay, I'm willing to give on this amendment if you give me that one. And that's pretty much how they do it. They very rarely actually meet, because if they meet, the public's allowed to be there, and they don't want us there. Okay, so here we go. And now if the House refuses to concur, then the Senate can grant a request for a conference committee, and the committee consists of 5 members, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's how they go to conference committee. Or if the House concurs with the Senate version, let's say that there's no changes, they're identical bills passed in both houses, it goes to what's called enrolled. So there's several terms that you'll learn throughout this whole process. Engrossed is when it basically leaves committee. Enrolled is when it's actually final passage and it becomes law unless the governor vetoes. And then they have the whole process where they have both chambers agree on the conference committee report, or else the bill can't be enrolled. So then it gets signed by the Speaker in the presence of the House, signed by the Lieutenant Governor in the presence of the Senate, sent to the Governor. The Governor can sign or refuse to sign, but notice how it still becomes law, whether he signs it or not. Signing is really just a ceremonial thing at that point. The only thing the Governor can do to stop something at that point is to veto it. The bill won't become law, or with a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate, they can override a governor's veto. Again, it's something that they don't do. Even though you and I might want a bill to be overridden, a governor's veto, it just very rarely happens that way.